Today for Read Aloud, we have chapter 5 in the BFG called The BFG. The giant picked up the trembling Sophie with one hand and carried her across the cave and put her on the table. Now he really is going to eat me, Sophie thought. The giant sat down and stared hard at Sophie. He had truly enormous ears. Each one was as big as the wheel of a truck, and he seemed to be able to move them inwards and outwards from his head as he wished. There was another example of figurative language, since we've been talking about that in the last few weeks, when I said each one was as big as the wheel of a truck. Were his ears really truck wheels? No, but that's how big they were. So when we visualize it in our head as I'm reading it, you should be thinking of such big ears that they would be as big as the wheels on a truck. "I is hungry," the giant boomed. He grinned, showing massive square teeth. The teeth were very white and very square, and they sat in his mouth like huge slices of white bread. "But please don't eat me," Sophie stammered. The giant let out a bellow of laughter. "Just because I is a giant, you think I is a man-gobbling cannibal," he shouted. "You is about right. Giants is all cannibally and murderful, and they does gobble up human beings. We is in giant country now. Giants is everywhere around. Out there, us has the famous bone-crunching giant. Bone-crunching giant crunches up 2 wopsy whiffling human beings for supper every night. Noise is ear-bursting." "Ouch," Sophie said. "Bone-crunching giant only gobbles human beings from Turkey," the giant said. "Every night Bone Cruncher is galloping off to Turkey to gobble Turks." Sophie's sense of patriotism was suddenly so bruised by this remark that she became quite angry. "Why Turks?" she blurted out. "What's wrong with the English?" "Bone-crunching giant says Turks is tasting ever so much juicier and more scrumdiddlyumptious. Bone Cruncher says Turkish human beings has a glamourly flavor. He says Turks from Turkey is tasting of Turkey." "I suppose they would," Sophie said. "Of course they would," the giant shouted. "Every human being is diddly and different. Some is scrumdiddlyumptious, and some is ucky slush. Greeks is all full of ucky slush. No giant is eating Greeks ever." "Why not?" Sophie said. "Greeks from Greece is all tasting greasy," the giant said. "I imagine that's possible too," Sophie said. She was wondering with a bit of a tremble what all this talking about eating people was leading up to. Whatever happened, she simply must play along with this peculiar giant and smile at his jokes. So this is them in his cave. This is the BFG, and that is Sophie sitting on his table. But were they jokes? Perhaps the great brute was just working up an appetite by talking about food. "As I am saying," the giant went on, "all human beings is having different flavors. Human beings from Panama is tasting very strong of hats." "Why hats?" she said. "You is not very clever," the giant said, moving his ears in and out. "I thought all human beings is full of brains, but your head is emptier than a bundungle." "Do you like vegetables?" Sophie asked, hoping to steer the conversation towards a slightly less dangerous kind of food. "You is trying to change the subject," the giant said sternly. "We is having an interesting babblement about the taste of the human bean. The human bean is not a vegetable." "Oh, but the bean is a vegetable," Sophie said. "Not the human bean," said the giant. "The human being has 2 legs and a vegetable has no legs at all." Sophie didn't argue anymore. The last thing she wanted to do was to make the giant cross. "The human being," the giant went on, "is coming in dillions of different flavors. For instance, human beings from Wales is tasting very whooshy of fish. There is something very fishy about Wales." "You mean whales," Sophie said. "Whales is something quite different. Wales is Wales, the giant said. Whales is a place, as well as whales are animals that live in the ocean. It is a homograph, which we've talked about, or not a homograph, a homophone, which we've talked about in school when we have words that sound the same, but they're spelled differently and they have different meanings. Okay. May I continue? Please do, Sophie said. Danes from Denmark is tasting ever so much of dogs, the giant went on. Of course, Sophie said. They taste of Great Danes. Wrong, cried the giant, slapping his thigh. Danes from Denmark is tasting doggy because they is tasting of Labradors. Then what do the people of Labrador taste of? Sophie asked. Danes, the giant said triumphantly. Great Danes. Aren't you getting a bit mixed up? Sophie said. I is a very mixed up giant, the giant said, but I does do my best, and I is not nearly as mixed up as the other giants. I know one who gallops all the way to Wellington for his supper. Wellington, Sophie said. Where's Wellington? Your head is full of squashed flies, the giant said. Wellington is in New Zealand. The human beings in Wellington has an especially scrumdiddlyumptious taste. So says the Welshie-eating giant. Welly-eating giant. What do the people of Wellington taste of? Sophie asked. Boots, the giant said. Of course, Sophie said. I should have known. Sophie decided that this conversation had now gone on long enough. If she was going to be eaten, she'd rather get it over with and done with right away than be kept hanging around anymore. What sort of human beings do you eat? She asked, trembling. Me, shouted the giant, his mighty voice making the glass jars rattle on the shelves. Me gobbling up human beings? This I never. The others, yes. All the others is gobbling them up every night, but not me. I is the only nice giant in giant country. I is the big, friendly giant. I is the BFG. What is your name? My name is Sophie, Sophie said, hardly daring to believe the good news she had just heard. That ends our chapter 5. And just to make sure everyone knows that this is a make-believe story, and sometimes the words that come out of the BFG character's mouth are make-believe words. So if it sounds funny when you hear them, it's because he's making them up. So a lot of his words are nonsense words, just so you know. All right, I hope you enjoyed that chapter. And tomorrow we will get to hear another chapter about, or I should say Thursday, and it will be introduced to the other giants that live in giant country. Hope you're enjoying the story.